Hey, David Brewster here from an episode of Scales and Tales, and this is Pentatonic Substitutions. Now, substitutions in music usually is related to chords, chord substitutions. And there are some substitution and some approaches you can use to scales, and I've chose minor pentatonic to start this because it's a little bit easier to kind of see what we're doing, and you can kind of hear it and find it, and then you can expand this to other scales and other ideas. But it's not really directly related to chord substitutions. Chord substitutions is a little complicated. I haven't really talked about it on this channel yet, but really instead of thinking of it as a substitution, we're really imposing, like a superimposing scales. So we're going to change the way that you're kind of thinking about using, especially minor pentatonic scales, but you could relate this to other scales and tonalities too. But to help you kind of understand what we're doing, here's an image I made with the Berklee College of Music definition of substitution, and then also just the Webster's Dictionary version of the definition of substitution. If you want to think of that generic definition, we're basically taking something and replacing it with something else. And in music, you can do that with chords. You can obviously do that with, steps of a scale and arpeggios, and there's a lot of different ways you can kind of change what you're playing. So in some ways, the common phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yeah, you can. You can teach an old dog new tricks. And we're going to teach this old scale, known as the pentatonic scale. We're going to teach the scale some new tricks too. So some of this you may have seen before, some of it you may not have seen before. And if this is all brand new to you, definitely dive into a lot of like the legends of jazz and fusion. Pat Martino, John Schofield, Pat Metheny, Scott Henderson, Mike Stern, listen to some of those players because those guys are masters of scale and chord substitutions. One more thing here, I am using the TC Electronic Ditto Looper for this lesson. I just want to kind of give you a heads up that I am going to be looping chords behind the scales and these substitutions that we're going to check out. And that's going to make this a lot easier. So if you have a way to loop or record, maybe you got a friend that plays guitar and they can play chords behind you, it's very important to hear the tonality and the key and the chord that you're playing over for this to really sink in. So this is important. That's why I'm pointing it out. All right, to begin, we're going to start with the minor pentatonic scale. So this should be common knowledge, like, a good place to begin, a foundation to work from and build from. So this is going to basically, make perfect sense, but it gives us a place to start. And there's some things about the minor pentatonic scale that some of you watching this may not realize. Some of you totally already know this. But the minor pentatonic is a 5-note scale, right? We've got a root, we've got a flat third, we've got a fourth, a fifth, and a flat 7, right? Most major and minor scales and modes are 7 notes. So those 5 notes are 2 notes away from being another scale, right? We're kind of subtracting 2 of the notes from a 7-note scale to build the pentatonic, which only has 5 notes. But you have to realize that those 5 notes of the minor pentatonic also appear in Aeolian, Dorian, and Phrygian, 3 of the modes from the major scale. You're just missing the 2nd and you're missing the 6th. And that's really important to understand because you're going to kind of see, okay, I'm missing this note and that note, and you can flesh that minor pentatonic out to a full scale or mode. And that's really, really important. So here's a chart that breaks this down so you can visually see the comparison between minor pentatonic, Aeolian, Dorian, and Phrygian. So in this lesson, we're just going to look at static chords, just a ringing single chord. We're not going to worry about progressions yet, because as soon as you change the single chord into a progression, it's going to dictate and kind of push you in a certain direction. And we just want to basically visit the tonality and kind of explore the sound of these substitutions over different chords, but just a single chord. So, we can definitely play the minor pentatonic over either E minor or E minor 7. That's pretty obvious. Since the notes from those 2 chords, E minor and E minor 7, also live in that minor pentatonic scale. So that fits together like pieces of a puzzle, right? So that's very, common knowledge. But did you know that there's actually a chord that perfectly fits the minor pentatonic scale? Because basically the minor pentatonic scale could be viewed as an arpeggio. It could be a minor 11th, because we have the root, the flat third, the fourth, the fifth, and the flat seven. So it's like a 5-note arpeggio. But it's also viewed as a scale too. But there's a chord that matches that tonality, and we're going to put it right here. And that's basically an E minor 11. Looks and sounds something like that. This chord actually has all 5 notes of the minor pentatonic scale. Alright, there's your E, the root. There's G, the minor third. There's B, the fifth. There's D, the flat 7. And here's A, the fourth, or 11th. So there's an E minor 11, which matches the minor pentatonic scale perfectly. You know, that chord and the scale, you know, fit together like, once again, like pieces of a puzzle. So there's E minor 11, and I've already recorded this with the looper, but, you know, play minor pentatonic over that, and it's going to fit perfectly. Right? Fits together perfect. You know, E minor 11 arpeggio, or E minor pentatonic. But the next example is the first kind of shift, or, you know, substitution, I guess, for the minor pentatonic scale. And most of you are probably already aware of this, because this is very, very common in rock and blues and country and, you know, tons of styles, southern rock and stuff. But we're going to convert minor pentatonic to major pentatonic. So this is very easy. And for a lot of you that have learned, like, you know, counting down 3 frets from the root, you know, that's one way you can do it. You know, just think of the minor pentatonic scale right there. Go back 3 frets, and you can think of C sharp minor pentatonic, which is also E major pentatonic. It just so happens, you know, strategically on the fretboard, when you shift the minor pentatonic back 3 frets, it lines up for those notes from the major, you know, scale. But you're basically playing a major pentatonic. So now we're going to play over this, which this is just E major. There's our static chord. And then when you play C sharp minor pentatonic over that chord, it's not going to sound like C sharp minor pentatonic. It's going to sound like E major pentatonic, like this. Right? Fits perfectly. Think of the Allman Brothers and Southern Rock and Skinners and stuff like that, and you can definitely find lots of, you know, bands and musicians using major pentatonic scales. Definitely in blues, you'll find blues guitarists mixing major and minor, kind of blurring back and forth. Up next is more of an alteration compared to like a substitution, because now what we're going to do is we're going to change and modify the minor pentatonic into the dominant pentatonic, or the other nickname is Lydian pentatonic. And I have featured this. There was actually a Breaking Chords episode where I featured, you know, Lydian pentatonic for the whole lesson. But all we're going to do now is we're going to modify E minor pentatonic so that it fits, you know, over a 7th chord, you know, like E7. And we can find E7 right here, like that. There's your root, major third. There's your flat 7. There's your root and your major third right there again. So to modify or alter the minor pentatonic into the dominant pentatonic, or Lydian pentatonic, we're just going to raise the G, which is the minor third, to G sharp, which is the major third. And that looks like this. You know, compared to the minor pentatonic, that sounds familiar. You can definitely hear, you know, Jeff Beck and Eric Johnson, Joe Satriani, you know, Bruce Bouillet from Racer X. There's a ton of guitarists that have played with that particular tonality and that modified, you know, pentatonic. So over that chord, you'll find it fits perfectly once again. But the next example is definitely substitution or superimposing, you know, minor pentatonic. And this definitely comes from players like Scott Henderson, John Scofield, some of those, you know, fusion and jazz players I mentioned earlier. And I think I learned this from, studying some of Scott Henderson and John Scofield's, educational material too. But the interesting thing we're going to do here is we're going to find a way to use pentatonic to discover a Lydian tonality. And Lydian's very, very popular, very exotic, for a major scale. It's kind of like a dark major scale. Steve Vai, Frank Zappa, and a ton of players are, notoriously well known for using Lydian. But it's a raised fourth, a sharp 11. And most people would never even think of using a minor pentatonic approach or fingering, to tackle something like Lydian. They usually just think of it as like a blues scale, or a country scale if it's major pentatonic. But the first thing, we're going to find the chord first. So that is basically an E add 9 sharp 11. Really cool chord. And then if you really map out, E Lydian, which that's, E Lydian right there. You'll find that it fits that chord. But there's also this kind of substitution, with pentatonic scale approach. So check this out. We're thinking of E Lydian, right? There's our root E, okay? So what I want you to do is think a half step lower and then play the minor pentatonic scale right there. So in your head, you can think of E flat minor pentatonic, but instead think of D sharp. That's technically what we're thinking of, the major seventh right there. E's the root, so that's our, major seventh. And that, D sharp minor pentatonic, which most of you probably want to think of that as E flat minor. D sharp minor doesn't really make sense, but since we're in the key of E, that's kind of why I'm calling it that. So if you listen to that scale, if you really look at what that gives you, we basically have the second, the sharp 4, and the 6th. We also have the 3rd and the 7th, of E major. We just don't have the root, and we don't have the 5th. We don't have E or B appearing, in this. But over that chord, you can hear how it fits. You're just missing that, the root note, and the 5th, that B note. So if you take, that D sharp minor pentatonic and add E and B, then you're suddenly playing Lydian. The full scale. Take the B and the E away, and you're playing D sharp minor pentatonic. But over that chord, it sounds like E Lydian. It doesn't sound like a minor pentatonic scale anymore. And that's a really, really cool substitution right there. The last example here is another alteration, or kind of a twist to the minor pentatonic. And it's not even really a minor pentatonic. We're going to look at E Hirajoshi, which is the Japanese pentatonic scale. And there are other pentatonic scales in music. There's more than just the major or minor pentatonic. Any 5-note scale is considered pentatonic because pent means 5. Therefore, pentatonic means 5-note scale. And Hirajoshi's been around for a while. There's definitely a lot of jazz and fusion players. Definitely Marty Friedman and Jason Becker. In their Cacophony days, they're definitely both historically well known for adding Hirajoshi into some of their shred and metal music too. So there's tons of players. From metal to jazz to classical, and obviously traditional Japanese music too. So this is going to be a little different because now we're modifying. It's still a 5-note scale, but it's not really related to the minor pentatonic or major or mixed Lydian pentatonic or Lydian pentatonic or any of the stuff we've looked at. So it's still a 5-note scale, but the structure is completely different. And you'll see we have the root, the 2nd, the flat 3rd, the 5th, and the flat 6. And that's it. There's E Hirajoshi. Root, 2nd, flat 3rd, 5th, flat 6, and then it begins again. crafty, you could pick close to the bridge and you can kind of imitate the sound of a koto, you know, a Japanese guitar. And then over a chord, you can definitely pick something that's appropriate, you know, for that tonality. And I chose this, which that's going to be an E minor add 9. You know, very mysterious sounding chord. But I included that mainly because we're targeting the ninth, you know, that F sharp, which appears in that scale. So over the chord, the scale sounds like this. You know, very exotic and dark, but a beautiful sound though. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Scales and Tales with pentatonic substitutions, and there are many other pentatonic applications that you can kind of find like this. You can kind of mimic or emulate the sound of Dorian and some other modes from the major scale, and there's other, you know, substitutions and scale substitutions like that. And this really will kind of help you get your foot in the pool of understanding chord substitutions, which is really the larger, you know, picture or the goal, I guess, of, you know, kind of diving into this and kind of getting your hands dirty with, you know, substituting scales and thinking about scales a little bit differently. And then that will extend whenever you feel like you're ready to dive into chord substitutions. That can get really confusing, but definitely getting your feet wet and your hands dirty with this info will kind of help you make that a little bit easier when you are tackling chord substitutions. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Lydian Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.